Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. I just had a reminder that I'm supposed to be doing a talk on My Dendrobiums. That's the title, My Dendrobiums. So that's all it's going to be about. But I thought what I'd do is go over on YouTube, because there's an awful lot of people out there that have some brilliant ideas. So I thought I'd put it out there. The sort of way I'd like to do it. And if you can add bits in that you think would be useful, great. But I thought I'd start off with sort of going over where dendrobiums come from, the part of the world, and the various climates that dendrobiums can be found in. Because some of these are actually quite high up and quite cool growers. And, then go over that type of thing. So sort of say the environment where they actually come from, and then I thought I'd move into here and go over the environment I've actually got to try and explain how close or not my environment is to some of the places they actually come from. And then I thought I'd move on to the seasonal adjustments for growing them, which will involve temperature ranges. You have to bear in mind a couple of my dendrobiums are actually classed as cool growers, so they don't do so well in the summer. And some of them are classed as warm growers, year-round growers basically. They don't do so well in the winter time because it's a bit chilly for them, a bit nippy. And I haven't got scarves and gloves and hats for them, so they just have to put up with it. So go over that sort of thing. And then as I move on, I'd start getting into my sets of dendrobiums, how I've split them up into how I think is the best way to look after them. Starting off with what I call the continuous growers, which in most cases are the Latoria types. And there's quite a few of them, well, 3 of my Latoria types are actually in bloom, this one. And then this little one down here, got 2 spikes on, and then my Rhodostictum that's just opened. So I've got some Latorias, and I've also got some Dendrobium phalaenopsis hybrids, all of which have got spikes on actually. I'm not going to get them out now. But and a few others that come into that set that would be continuous growers if they had the right conditions. And you have to bear in mind that virtually all dendrobiums come from a part of the world that get a wet and a dry season. And that can be spread a little bit as well, because the farther north from the equator you get, possibly the farther south as well, you're starting to get into a form of spring and autumn as well. There is a transition temperature-wise between the summer rain season and the drier winter season that you could call autumn. And bearing in mind quite a lot of the deciduous dendrobiums actually come from deciduous forests. Well, if you've got a place where the leaves fall off the trees, you've got autumn. So some of them do come from a 4-seasonal place rather than just the 2 seasons, wet and dry. So I can go over all those sort of variables. But starting with the warm growers, I have to question, and this is a question not necessarily for the talk, but this goes out there now. If dendrobiums come from the warmer parts, where there is a wet and a dry season, what we're talking about here is tropical rainforests where the leaves don't fall. They're evergreen, but they do get a very wet season followed by very little rain, a drier season. But they don't get spring and autumn. Yeah, they just get those 2 seasons. Now, if you own dendrobiums from those parts, that would include the Latorias, how would they grow if you didn't give them a dry season? All the writings, all the books, everywhere you look, it'll say drier in winter. What is it actually saying? Is it saying drier in winter because that's where they come from, or because that's what they need? Bearing in mind that drier season has nothing to do with triggering blooms on those continuous grower types, because they can bloom any time of year. Yeah? So I do wonder about this drier winter for some of the dendrobiums. Is it really necessary? Now with me it is, because they're going to get the lower temperatures. Yeah? But the temperatures I'm giving them here are lower than what they would get in their natural habitat. So yes, I do reduce my watering in the winter, but it does make me wonder sometimes, do they really need that drier winter? If you can keep your temperatures up and keep your light okay, and your day lengths okay, in theory they should just continue growing and not have any form of hiccup at all. Food for thought. Anyway, sidetracked, as usual, you know me. Yeah, so that's my set that I call my continuous growers, that they do slow down a bit in the winter, possibly not quite as much this year because of the lights, but the cooler temperatures will mean they're not growing as fast or hardly at all. They don't need so much water and they're not going to need much feed. So that's number one set. And then the next set are those that need a semi-rest. In other words, they do come from deciduous forests, so they do get much brighter light in the winter time because the leaves fall off. They get far less moisture. It doesn't rain very often, hardly at all in fact, in a lot of the places. And as a consequence, the writings and the books will say no water from so and so, whatever it is, Halloween till Valentine's Day. Well, if you want a lot of dead orchids, that's a good way to proceed. No water at all. Orchids don't grow in a place where there's no water. If you think about those forests where they've just had a lot of rain all through the summer, they're soaking wet. It takes quite a while for them to dry out. The leaves fall, they've got bright light, but some of them come from quite high elevations. There's not much temperature going on, so there's not huge amounts of evaporation going on. And where you get daytime temperatures higher than nighttime temperatures, you get morning dew. So they're getting some moisture. They're not dry, not bone dry at all. So there are those that go into that category, and then there are those in that category. The chances are, providing you do reduce the feed down to nothing during the winter and give them the bright light and keep the watering at a minimum, you've got to think, now when do these plants bloom? Now if they bloom in late winter, early spring, this winter rest thing is part of the blooming process. It's what kicks the blooms out. So without it, you will either get far less blooms or possibly even none at all. Yeah? So bear that in mind. But if they come from deciduous forests where they would get that drier, cooler winter and much brighter light, but they don't bloom till the summer or the autumn, then that resting period has nothing to do whatsoever with the blooms. It's just the environment they live in. And then you question yourself, well, do I really need to replicate that then? I wonder what they would do if you didn't rest them at all. If you had the temperatures and the day lengths and the bright light, would they just carry on growing through the winter? Our winter, yeah? And be bigger, healthier, stronger plants as a consequence? Because it's nothing to do with triggering the blooms. If the blooms don't come until the summer or even into the autumn, then the winter rest has nothing to do with those blooms. Nothing at all. It's purely because that's the environment they live in. So they get it. But do they need it? Anyway, back to the talky bits. So the idea would be that once I get into the care, I would start looking at individual orchids so that I can name them, show some video clips of them, pictures of the blooms if I've got any. Most of my dendrobiums have actually bloomed. There aren't many that haven't. So do it in sort of that sort of way and get into the individual orchids. And as such, I need to start getting some clips together, because if I'm going to show what they look like now as they start their winter rest, a lot of my long cane dendrobiums, the anosmum and things like that, they've still got their leaves on, they're still green. Well, come the end of winter they won't be. They'll probably have either got yellow leaves or even dropped a lot of them. and the buds will start forming. But if I'm going to do a seasonal view of them, I've got to capture those images now as we go into the rest period, so that when I do the you know, the seasonal care, I've got some clips of what the orchids look like at the different times of year. Now the talk's in May, so I'm going to have difficulty showing what they're like at the, well, I suppose now is the end of the season, at the end of the growing season. What I won't be able to show is what they look like in the middle of the growing season, because I haven't got the clips. But you can use, people will have to use their imagination. Yeah, so that'll be a sort of outline of the sort of things I want to include. The part of the world they come from, the different environments involved in the wild, and then my own environment, and then how I've split mine up into sets for care purposes, culture purposes, and then get down to the individual dendrobiums within those sets and talk about each one relatively briefly. I've got 3/4 of an hour. This video could end up 3/4 of an hour, and I'm only after ideas. You know how I go on a bit. But yeah, as a basic outline, that sort of thing. So if there's anything you think I ought to include about dendrobiums that I haven't sort of outlined in this chat, then spark it off in a comment. I'm always open to ideas. And you have to bear in mind, I've got quite a lot of quite experienced growers sitting listening to me, so I don't want to make any almighty boo-boos and deviate too far from into what I call the unknown. I'm sticking to the orchids I've got. Many of them I've had for quite a few years now, so I've taken them through several winter processes to get them to how they are now, and that's the arena I want to do the talk about. I don't want to venture off into orchids I haven't got or have no experience of. To me, that would be a little bit dangerous ground to tread on. So that's the ideas, and see what you can come up with. As I say, there are a lot of dendrobiums in here. It's probably about 1/3 of my collection, but some of them are very small. That's a dendrobium, believe it or not. It's tiny. It's a genuine miniature. It's got really thick, fleshy leaves like a succulent, and I can never remember what it is. It is, and when I look at the tag, I can never say it. It is, if I can keep it still long enough to read it, Lichenostrum, I believe. And that came from Alberto as one of the ones he sent me when he had to get rid of his collection to go and work in Kew Gardens. I'll bet it's cold there in the mornings at the moment. I was on the news this morning. They're starting their Christmas display. But yeah, we do go from things like that, through to things like this and this, up to things like this and like this. So I have got quite a good variety in here, so I think it will make an interesting talk. Anyway, I've got stuff to do today, and I'll see you next time. And please have a think about the sort of things you would like to hear about if you were having a talk at your Orchid Society on dendrobiums. Yeah? And we'll see where we go from there. Thanks for dropping by. See you next time.